It's a pretty common situation to find yourself on the river with just top pair, not the greatest kicker in the world, and your opponent checks to you. And as a default, are you betting here or checking it behind? Regardless of what your answer is there, stick around because I'm going to give you some general tips for playing top pair on the river much better. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and today I want to talk about playing top pair better. Top pair tends to create a lot of confusion for players, especially when it's not necessarily the strongest kicker in the world. So let's talk about this hand a little bit. To frame this discussion, let's use the example on page 21 from my new Advanced Poker Workbook. And the prompt here is this. You're playing a 5-10 cash game, you open raise preflop and they defend their big blind, you delay c-bet the turn, and they check the river to you. And we have ace 10, flop is ace 6-5, jack on the turn, 9 on the river, so pretty representative both flop and also turn and river runout given the particular flop texture. And here is our opponent's checking range on the river, so the entire range that the solver says they would check behind based upon the way the game tree is set up. So before we go any further here, I want you to leave a quick comment down below and let me know if you would bet this as a default or check this behind. And if you do bet, what number would you bet it for? Remembering the pot is 115 right this moment. So regardless of what you would do, the way the rest of this page is set up is essentially looking at the EV of checking this behind right this moment, because it's going to be your equity right this moment times the overall pot size. That lets you know what your EV of the check behind is, and then comparing that to the EV of betting say 60 and getting continuance from middle pair or better, and then also betting 100 and seeing what things look like if the continuance is top pair or better. So before we get into the technical elements of playing top pair, I want to leave you with one major starting tip first and foremost, and that is to not get married to your hand. Do not think just because you have top pair you automatically have to bet in all situations on all possible runouts, and also don't think just because you have top pair that a single pair isn't going to ever be strong enough to bet for value on the river. It's just one pair after all, and then default always check behind when you have top pair on the river, again regardless of runout or who your opponent is or anything like that. So don't get married to your hand, and also don't automatically assume the top pair is never worth a bet, because 9 times out of 10 that's not necessarily going to be true. Now getting into some of the more technical elements, tip number 2 is to think about your opponent's current range right this moment. Tip number 2 takes us into some of the more technical elements, and that is thinking about our opponent's range right this moment. So when they get here, we notice that if we explore this range, there are some combinations in here that beat us, right? There's ace queen, there's ace jack, there's also going to be 8-7, that straight draw that did end up improving on the river, and of course all those things have us in really bad shape. But there are definitely hands in here that we do very, very well against, like ace x with the worst kicker, there's some jack x in there that we do well against, and of course that's all well and good for us, which can actually bring us to the EV of checking right this moment and starting by answering some of those questions. So for that we can use the river bet versus check EV spreadsheet. I filled in the pot size right this moment since it is 115, and one thing we can do is put everything into Flopzilla, and then from there we can start getting our overall equity right this moment. So we have the board, we have our hand, we have our opponent's range taken directly from the answer key of the workbook, and we notice if we look right here, our equity is 81.6%, or we can round that right up to 82, make life a little bit simpler. So that goes right here, and we notice the EV of checking this behind is plus $94. So nothing to complain about right this moment. Now tip number 3 is going to take us to the next level of the technical analysis, and this is really the most important point, and that is thinking about the range that our opponent would continue with if we bet. And to explore this, let's just go through the next section. So if they only give your $60 bet action, again 60 into a 115 pot, if they're only going to give that action with middle pair or better, they're going to fold weak pair and worse, then what is the EV of betting $60 in this situation? And what we can then do is start comparing the EV of betting certain sizes to the EV of checking, and of course if a bet is higher EV, we should be betting. If a bet is going to be lower EV, then checking is going to be preferable. So to do this, we can go over to Flopzilla again. We can click in the middle pair or better, since that is the qualifier we have right here, right? Folds from weak pair and nothing and all that sort of fun stuff. We're going to lock this in by clicking it, and that's going to give us our equity against the entire range overall. So this is the entire continuance range we have from our opponent. And what do we have here? So we have our equity goes up to 74%. That is our win percentage when called, so 74. How often are they going to fold right this moment? Well, they are continuing 71% of the time, which means they are going to be folding the other 29%. Perfect, and the bet size we're firing for is 60, and thus the EV of betting to $60 right this moment is going to be plus EV to the tune of 114. But with the workbook, I wanted you to go a step further and not just look at a single size against the EV of checking, but also look at another size with a different continuance possibility. That way you can kind of see side by side, hey, if I bet a bigger number and I get a lesser continuance, what is the EV of that compared to maybe a smaller bet with a larger continuance compared to just, of course, the EV of checking overall. So to do this, we can go back into Flopzilla and we can make a slight modification and say it's just going to be top pair or better on the continuance. Notice that we still have this checked in, so the equity that we have is going to drop down to 45%. That is our win percentage when called, drops to 45. We are betting $100 instead of 60. And how often are they going to be folding? Well, they're continuing 33% of the time, which means they are going to be folding, 67% of the time, and the EV of that is going to be plus EV to the tune of $91. Now, there is a very important technical aspect that we have not talked about yet, and actually has the EVs that we just calculated being a little bit simplified, because we have not yet talked about tip number 4, which is having a plan if you face a raise. So if nothing else, it's helpful to ask yourself that question. If I face a raise in this situation, say we bet 60 and our opponent check raises up to, I don't know, 220, what is our plan right that moment? And remember that a bet here can still be plus EV, even if we end up bet folding, especially if villain is only really likely to check raise with an extremely nutty range of hands, where essentially your ace-10 is going to be extremely dominated. Because what many players mistakenly do, especially when they're a little bit tighter and a little bit more risk averse, is they end up betting here, they say, okay, I think betting is going to be good, they bet, they face a check raise, they end up bet folding, and they talk themselves into saying, oh, my bet must have been terrible because I had to bet fold. But if your opponent's really never going to bluff check raise, then there's really not too much to be concerned about. As long as the overall bet is higher EV than checking behind, even though you are going to bet fold some of the time, that's totally okay. And the honest thing is that most games that you're playing in, especially if you're playing in smaller online games or smaller live cash games, where your opponents just simply do not bluff check raise rivers anywhere near enough of the time, it can be a totally viable spot to bet for value, even though you are going to sometimes have to bet fold it when they check raise, because again, that check raise is coming in very rarely and typically very nutted. And then the final tip here is thinking about your bet sizing options. Right here we looked at a $60 bet, and we also looked at a $100 bet, so roughly half-ish pot and getting closer to 100% pots. And it's very important that if your opponent can think at all, think about what they would think about your range based upon the size. Would they say, oh, $60 has to represent this or that, and a bigger bet has to represent this or that, or an over bet has to represent this or that, and is mostly going to be weak or strong, whatever. If they can at all think about what your bet size represents, then it's very important to be thinking on that level. It might be a very good spot to actually overbet, because your opponent's going to look at that and say, oh, that has to be a bluff, and then they actually start snapping you off of something like 6x or 5x, or maybe they river to 9x kind of hand, and then they're more likely to get very sticky with those second best combos. So don't just think, oh, one size or one bet size fits all in these situations. That's oftentimes not going to be the case, especially if your opponent can think just a little bit. That can definitely influence your overall bet size choice in the end. And just in case you're interested in seeing what the solver would do in this exact situation, this is the game tree pulled up in GTO Plus, and by the way, these are included when you buy the Advanced Poker Workbook. So if we look at the situation on the river, notice we have our bets in blue. If we hover over ace-10 offsuit, all of those are going to be bets. So really no question from the solver's point of view what should be getting bet here, but this is definitely in line with the solver. But of course the solver assumes a perfect solver opponent, and the honest truth is that your opponents are not solver approved. In fact, no human is actually solver perfect. So as a general default, when it comes to playing top pair, gun to head, if I said, hey, I have to bet it or I have to check it as a default, I'm going to default be betting top pair. That's just simply the way it's going to be, because in most games against most opponents, betting top pair is going to be higher EV than just checking, and while you may not be able to necessarily get away with a pot sizer, it's definitely something that you want to be doing a lot more, especially if you're default just checking top pair regularly in your game right this moment. And if you want to see another example of playing top pair really well, definitely make sure to click that video right up there, check it out, and I can't wait to see what you think about playing top pair in that spot, and if you'd also bet it, or check it. Probably bet it, right?